Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into an analysis that connects some incredibly powerful global forces. We're talking about an economic alliance that's challenging the US dollar, a mountain of national debt that some analysts are calling a ticking time bomb, and a major geopolitical conflict that, from this viewpoint, is the result of decades of policy. We're going to break down the argument for how these things, which might seem totally separate, are actually deeply intertwined, creating a kind of perfect storm that could reshape the world as we know it. Before we jump in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and check out the links in the description if you're looking for a real estate agent in your market or you need life insurance. My team and I can help you anywhere nationwide.
So this is really the big question, isn't it? It's the one that frames this entire analysis we're digging into today. For decades, for as long as most of us have been alive, the US dollar has been the bedrock of the global economy. It's what has given the United States this incredible, unparalleled economic and political advantage. But as this argument goes, that dominance is now facing its biggest challenge yet, and honestly, the outcome could affect every single person on the planet.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. This is our roadmap. First, we'll look at the external challenge to the dollar. Then we're going to turn inward and look at the immense pressure of U.S. debt. From there, we'll examine the real price of global military power before tying all these threads together in a huge case study, the expansion of NATO and the deeply contested history of the conflict in Ukraine.
Okay, let's get right into it. Section 1. According to this analysis, the biggest external threat to the current financial system is coming from an alliance you've probably heard of, called BRICS. Now, this group has been building momentum for years, and they have a goal that is crystal clear and incredibly ambitious.
So first off, what exactly is BRICS? Well, the acronym, it originally stood for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. It's an economic bloc. And according to the analysis we're exploring, its entire reason for being, its foundational mission, is to build a parallel financial system, one that doesn't depend on, and more importantly, can't be controlled by the United States and its currency.
And, this is not some small, exclusive club anymore, not by a long shot. As you can see, the alliance has gotten a lot bigger. The source material we're looking at says that at least 22 countries are now members, and even more are lining up wanting to join. This is presented as this rapidly growing coalition that represents a massive chunk of the world's population and economic output, all coming together around one single, very powerful idea.
And that one idea, it's about as direct as it gets: get off the American dollar. The analysis argues that this is the absolute core, the driving force behind the entire alliance. They want to put an end to their dependence on a system where their own economic health is tied to the currency of another nation. They're looking to trade with each other, in their own currencies, or maybe even create a whole new reserve currency, all to break free from the dollar's grip.
So you have to ask, why the big push? Why is this so urgent for them? The source uses this quote to really get to the heart of the motivation. It argues that the United States hasn't just used the dollar for trade, but has wielded it like a weapon. See, when a country's financial system runs on US dollars, their money is effectively held in US banks, and that gives the US the power to just shut off their cash through sanctions. The source points to Iran and Russia as prime examples where financial sanctions had absolutely devastating effects. So the BRICS nations are basically saying, nope, we don't want to be vulnerable to that anymore.
And this brings us to the really critical question. What are the consequences if this actually works? What happens if BRICS succeeds? According to this analysis, the fallout for the United States could be catastrophic. The source predicts the economy could just go into a free fall as the global demand that props up all of America's deficit spending just evaporates. It even warns of a depression that could make the 1930s look like, and I quote, a cakewalk.
So the threat from BRICS is framed as this big external pressure. But for that pressure to really work, there have to be internal weaknesses, right? Cracks in the foundation. And according to this analysis, the United States has a colossal one, a mountain of debt that is reaching what the source calls completely unsustainable levels.
Let's just take a second and look at this number. $34 trillion. It's a number so huge it's almost meaningless. You can't really wrap your head around it. This isn't just a budget problem for 1 year. This is the total accumulated debt over the entire history of the country. And the source we're examining presents this as a massive, massive structural vulnerability for the U.S. economy. But what's really crucial to get is the speed at which this is all happening. That $34 trillion number, it's not sitting still. The source we're reviewing points out that in just the last 100 days, another $1 trillion was piled on top. $1 trillion in just over 3 months. This isn't some slow leak. The analysis describes it as a fire hose of new debt just flooding the system. So what's the actual cost of this debt? I mean, what does it mean in real terms? This is where the argument gets really, really alarming. The service on the debt, that's just the interest payments, not even paying it down, is now larger than the entire official U.S. military budget. Think about that. The source says the annual interest is over $1 trillion, while the military budget is around $890 billion. The country is now spending more just to service old debt than it is to fund its entire defense apparatus. And the source projects a terrifying trajectory from here. Within just 5 years, it claims that 50 cents of every single tax dollar collected will go to nothing but interest payments. And within 10 years, that number could become 100%. 100% of all tax dollars just servicing the debt. That would leave nothing for the military, for Social Security, for roads, for anything. And the source adds a really critical warning. This timeline assumes interest rates stay where they are. If they go up, this whole schedule could accelerate dramatically.
The source also gets into where this recent debt explosion came from, and it's pretty clear this is seen as a bipartisan issue. It states that during his 4 years in office, President Trump added $8 trillion to the national debt. Now, to put that into perspective, in that one 4-year term, more debt was added than in the first 283 years of the country's history combined, from George Washington all the way through George W. Bush. And the analysis is quick to note that President Biden has continued very similar spending policies, framing this not as a party problem, but as a deep systemic one.
So who are we on the hook to? Who holds all this debt? Well, a big chunk is held by foreign powers like China and Japan, but a lot is also held right here at home by U.S. investors and banks. But here's where it connects back to our first section. The source points out that even major creditors like China are now actively trying to get away from the dollar. It seems like they see the risk here and are trying to insulate themselves from what could be a pretty nasty crisis.
And this leads us right into our next section. If the debt is this high, you have to ask, where is all the money going? Well, a huge piece of this puzzle, according to this analysis, is the absolutely immense cost of maintaining America's global military power. A cost that is way, way bigger than most people realize.
So you see the official military budget, right? It's a mind-boggling $890 billion. But the source argues that's not even the whole story. When you add in the cost of the Veterans Administration, that's about $300 billion a year, plus other national security costs, the true annual total is much closer to $1.3 trillion. And one of the biggest drivers of that cost, the analysis says, is just the sheer scale of the U.S. global footprint. Before we continue, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and check out the links in the description if you're looking for a real estate agent in your market or you need life insurance. My team and I can help you anywhere nationwide. The source presents a comparison here that is, well, it's pretty stark. The United States maintains approximately 800 military bases scattered all around the world. In contrast, China and Russia have fewer than 3 combined. This enormous network, the analysis argues, is what makes the U.S. the policeman of the world, and each and every one of those bases represents not just a huge expense, but in the source's view, an opportunity for a new little war. So who's benefiting from this constant state of readiness and, well, conflict? The source points its finger directly at the major military contractors. We're talking about companies like Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and General Dynamics. These corporations form the core of what's often called the military-industrial complex. An engine that, according to this analysis, has a very powerful vested interest in keeping this expensive global posture going.
And now we get to one of the most significant and frankly controversial claims in the entire source material. It alleges that these competing military contractors aren't really competing at all. It claims they're largely owned by one single investment firm, BlackRock. The analysis goes even further, claiming that BlackRock holds contracts to both supply weapons to a conflict and then to rebuild the country afterward, creating what the source describes as this powerful circular economic incentive for perpetual conflict.
So let's recap. According to the viewpoint we're examining, we have the external pressure from brics, the internal weakness from the debt, and these huge economic incentives from the military-industrial complex. Now let's see how these forces allegedly played out in a real-world scenario, the history of NATO's expansion, which this source presents as the absolute critical backdrop to what's happening today in Ukraine.
This quote, "The source presents this as the foundational promise, the moment that set the stage for everything that was to come. At the very end of the Cold War, the U.S. Secretary of State James Baker allegedly gave this personal assurance to the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. NATO would not expand into former Soviet territories, not 1 inch."
The source lays out the sequence of events like this.
Gorbachev makes a huge concession. He agrees to let Germany reunify within NATO, even pulling 450,000 Soviet troops out of East Germany to make it happen. In return, he gets that promise of no eastward expansion. But then, just 5 years later, a completely new plan emerges, one that advocates for the exact opposite, a plan to push NATO right up to Russia's borders, into all those former Soviet territories.
Now, this new plan wasn't exactly met with universal applause. The source really emphasizes that some of the most respected figures in American foreign policy, we're talking George Kennan, the guy who architected the whole Cold War containment strategy, former heads of the CIA, they all sounded the alarm. They reportedly predicted that this exact policy would turn Russia into a guaranteed enemy and would ultimately force a violent response down the line.
So this is the crucial question, right? If so many seasoned diplomats and intelligence experts saw this as a potentially disastrous path, why did it happen anyway? The source dismisses the official geopolitical reasons and instead points to a very powerful underlying incentive.
And here is where we circle right back to the military-industrial complex. The source argues that the primary driver for expansion was simple: economics. See, when a new country joins NATO, it is required to standardize its military. That means it has to overhaul its weapon systems to meet NATO specifications. And who makes NATO spec weapons? You guessed it, the same American contractors we listed earlier. Every single new member nation represented a huge, brand new market for these companies, creating a powerful economic reason to just keep expanding the alliance.
And this brings us to the flashpoint. For decades, Russia had been saying that NATO expansion into Ukraine was an absolute red line for them. The source we're looking at argues that the events that followed were the completely predictable result of all the policies we've just been discussing.
This analysis zeroes in on 2014 as the year everything changed. It alleges that the elected neutral government of Ukraine was overthrown in a coup that it attributes directly to the CIA and US aid. In response, Russia annexed Crimea, which is home to its only warm-water naval port. The source claims this was done without a single shot fired and that the local population then voted 90% to rejoin Russia. The analysis then states that the new government in Ukraine passed laws against the Russian language, which triggered a violent 8-year conflict in the Donbas region, claiming it resulted in 14,000 deaths, mostly of ethnic Russians.
Now, to support this claim of U.S. involvement in that 2014 change of government, the source points to a very specific piece of evidence: a leaked audio recording. On this tape, a senior U.S. diplomat, Victoria Nuland, can allegedly be heard having a conversation with the U.S. ambassador about who should and should not be in the new Ukrainian cabinet, a full month before the elected government was actually overthrown. So, in the middle of this escalating conflict, a potential way out emerged: the Minsk Accords. This was a detailed peace agreement. It was brokered and approved by France, Germany, and the UK. And its key parts were pretty simple. Ukraine would remain neutral and not join NATO, and in return, the Donbas region would get autonomy. It was seen by many as a real, viable path to peace. According to the source, the desire for this peace deal within Ukraine was just overwhelming. So much so that in 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky was elected with a massive 70% of the vote. And his campaign was based on a single promise: to finally sign the Minsk Accords and bring peace. But then, after taking office, he did a complete 180 and refused to implement the agreement.
This pivot is really the final, critical turning point in this whole narrative. So why did it happen? The source is very clear that we don't know for sure, but it puts forward two main possibilities. The first is that he was threatened by powerful hardline nationalist factions right there in his own government. And the second possibility offered is that the United States intervened and essentially told him that he was not allowed to sign that peace deal. So let's just step back and tie this all together. The analysis we've walked through today presents this incredibly complex, interconnected story. It starts with an external economic challenge from the BRICS nations wanting to de-dollarize. That threat is made much more powerful by a severe internal crisis in the U.S., that mountain of debt. A huge chunk of that debt, it's argued, is driven by a foreign policy of constant military expansion, specifically NATO, which is itself motivated by powerful economic incentives. And finally, the conflict in Ukraine is presented not as some surprise event, but as the inevitable, predictable result of all these powerful forces finally colliding.
And that brings us to our final question. Does this perfect storm of crises signal that a great power is in decline? Or are we just witnessing the painful birth of a new, multipolar world? The analysis we've looked at today certainly presents a stark warning, and it leaves us to wonder if the current system can be fixed, or if it's simply destined to be replaced. Thank you for joining us on The Explainer. Before you go, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and check out the links in the description if you're looking for a real estate agent in your market or you need life insurance. my team and I can help you anywhere nationwide.